Hello everyone, welcome to Psychology 101, General Psychology, and today we're going to briefly talk about social thinking. So let's start off talking about attributions. So we make attributions about other people's behaviors all the time. And we try to figure out, all right, why are people behaving in the way that they are? Sometimes we make internal attributions. That's when we pretty sure that people are behaving like they are because that's just how they are, because of their personality. And sometimes we make external attributions. We think people are behaving because they're forced to, because that's the way their environment allows them to behave. In general, we like to explain other people's behaviors in terms of internal attributions or dispositions. And a lot of times we explain our own behaviors in terms of the situation or in terms of external attributions, especially if we perform negative behaviors, if we do something wrong. So why does this occur? Well, this is what's known as the fundamental attribution error. We pay attention more to people than we do to situations, and we simply just don't account for the fact that situations can influence people's behaviors as much. So what about some other impressions that we make? We oftentimes take into account nonverbal behaviors. These are behaviors that are often difficult to control, that more often than not can occur with verbal behaviors, so talking to someone, but sometimes they can communicate information without people necessarily knowing. And we as humans are actually pretty good at picking up on these. Through what's known as thin slicing, we can have a pretty good idea of someone's personality and general dispositions just by watching small snippets of video or looking at photos of someone. Sometimes we can use these nonverbal behaviors to mimic or copy another person's behavior. This can lead to basically liking someone more if we mimic their behavior or if someone mimics our behavior. And sometimes we do this unintentionally. Sometimes we non-consciously mimic another person's behavior if maybe they are our superior, and we unconsciously, subconsciously want them to like us more. So let's move on to attitudes. Attitudes are one of the most important constructs within social psychology. Attitudes are simply an evaluation of something, anything, an attitude object. So how do you feel about Skittles, or how do you feel about Justin Timberlake? Do you like them? Do you not like them? It can be positive or negative. Sometimes we can have positive and negative feelings about the same object. Sometimes we can like Skittles, but at the same time dislike Skittles because they're maybe unhealthy for us. And sometimes this can differ between what are known as explicit and implicit attitudes. Explicit attitudes are basically the conscious attitudes that we're aware of, that we're able to verbalize, whereas implicit attitudes are the kind of associations that we automatically have with objects. These are built up over time, and sometimes we're not even aware of our own implicit attitudes. So how do attitudes form? Sometimes we end up liking things because we encounter them a lot. This is known as the mere exposure effect. The more we encounter a stimulus, the more we actually like it. Sometimes we're conditioned to like things. Sometimes we build up these associations between an object and positivity or an object and negativity, and that leads us to have positive or negative attitudes about the object. Attitudes are generally pretty good at predicting behaviors, but not always. We tend to see that attitudes are best predictive of behaviors when people are not worrying about self-presenting, when people maybe believe that they can't lie or they don't want to lie. And we especially see attitudes predict behaviors when the self is made salient. So when people look into a mirror, for example, or people are reminded of who they are as a person, they tend to want to maintain this consistency between the attitudes they have and the way that they behave. But what happens when this isn't consistent? What if sometimes people behave in ways that are inconsistent with their attitudes? Well, we see something known as dissonance occur. This is when people have this kind of negative feeling or physiological response to behaving in a manner that is inconsistent with attitudes. And people want to get rid of this feeling. People want to reduce dissonance in any way they can. And generally the best way of doing that is actually to change behaviors, not to change attitudes. If you behave in a way that's inconsistent with your attitudes, you can't take that back, but you can change the way you think about that stimulus or that object. So oftentimes we see dissonance reduction occur by having people change their own attitudes. This is really weird because you would think that people would want to maintain their attitudes as much as possible, but we see actually the reverse occur. So that's one way that attitudes can change. How are some other ways in which attitudes can change? Well, We see this happen through persuasion quite a bit. And this is when basically one person tries to convince another person to change their attitudes. This could be changing the extremity of their attitudes from very strong to weak, or it could be changing the valence, having a positive attitude towards the justice system to maybe a negative attitude. Through the elaboration likelihood model, we can identify two different routes in which we process persuasion attempts, or in which we process arguments that are attempting to persuade us to change our attitudes. The peripheral route focuses on cues that are not involved in the specific argument, that don't involve argument quality. So it could be using heuristics, it could be using attractiveness, credibility cues, basically anything that isn't always necessarily valid. So we may be more likely to listen to a persuasion attempt by someone wearing a white coat because that represents intelligence, maybe, even though we might not actually be listening to the message that the argument that they're using. When we actually listen to the argument, that's when we follow central route processing. This is focusing, using a thoughtful analysis of the actual argument. Ideally, we would focus only on central route processing. We wouldn't use peripheral route processing at all. But again, individuals, humans, want to try to be as efficient as possible. So we tend to fall back on these peripheral route attitudes, these heuristics, for example, more so than central routes. We just don't have the time and effort and capability to focus on argument quality every single time. So a lot of people then use these heuristics or use these peripheral route cues to persuade other people to change attitudes. Some of these techniques focus on encouraging people to maintain consistency. So the foot in the door technique, for example, asks people a small request and then slowly and slowly builds up to larger and larger requests. Some persuasion techniques focus on the norm of reciprocity. So if I do something for you, then hopefully you will do something back for me, because there's that drive to kind of make things even. This is what the door in the face technique focuses on. And also we can focus on familiarity heuristics. So we tend to be more persuaded by people who are similar to us, who are more familiar to us, persuaded by authority figures, and other things like that. So lastly, let's talk about social influence. There are different types of social influence. Persuasion is one, but generally when we talk about social influence, we're talking about conformity, we're talking about obedience, and we're also talking about how do we work in groups, how are we influenced by people in groups. And the situation is very powerful. For example, the people that we have around us can drastically influence how well we perform on a task. So per social facilitation, the dominant behavior that would arise in a situation is increased if there are a lot of people around. So for example, if we're good at shooting free throws, if there are a lot of people around, we'll do better. But if we're not good at shooting free throws, if there are a lot of people around, we'll do worse. So what are some terms that we need to know in terms of social influence? Social norms are standards of behavior established and enforced by a group. So what are you supposed to do in a given situation? What is the normal thing to do? And generally we try to conform to those norms. Conformity is, again, changing behavior to fit in with or reflect those norms. And we generally conform for two reasons. We conform when we want to behave appropriately or correctly, and we conform when we want to fit in. So these two different types of social influence have been demonstrated a lot within, especially social psychology. Informational social influence focuses on when we want to behave correctly, and normative social influence focuses on when we want to fit in with one another, when we don't want to stand out. So understanding how people conform and why people conform via social influence is extremely important. So what about, maybe not instances where we are changing our own behaviors because we want to, but what about instances in which we are obeying orders or behaving in ways because someone is directly asking us to? Well, these are examples of obedience. This is performing an action in line with the directive order. And there are, similar to social norms, there are norms of obedience. People don't normally question authority, and people don't normally question experts. And this is demonstrated perfectly through the Milgram studies, where individuals were told to shock another participant in another room if they got a question wrong. And they kind of followed through with these shocks until they delivered what they thought was a lethal dose of electric shock to the participant who was not actually in the other room. But people were following through with these orders, not really thinking about what they were actually doing. So what fuels this? Well, people follow authority. If people think that the person telling them what to do knows what they're doing, they're just going to do it. And we do see some situations where people are less likely to obey some of these very drastic orders. If other members of a group rebel against the authority figure, then other people are more likely to rebel. If the authority figure isn't close, less likely to follow him. And there are other factors that are just equally important for following obedience. So what about working within groups? If we think about obedience, if we think about social influence, all of these terms, all of these concepts come up when we're working in groups, when we're working maybe on a task with other people. Maybe there's a leader. We conform or we obey the leader, and we are influenced by other members of the group. And generally we form groups for one of two reasons: to belong, to connect with other people, or to achieve goals, to perform some kind of task. Especially within task groups, people can take advantage of the fact that they're working with other people. So for example, we sometimes see social loafing. That's when a person doesn't put forth the appropriate amount of effort that they would if they were working on this task alone. We see this happen because there's a diffusion of responsibility. They're not necessarily individuated in the group. They are just a member of a larger being, a larger entity. And this can be reduced through what's known as evaluation apprehension. When someone is aware that they're going to be, watched or be evaluated on their individual contribution to the group, then we see social loafing reduce. And we mentioned the individuation. That's an extremely important thing to consider as well. We tend to see individuals who are kind of engrossed in a group tend to perform more deviant behaviors or behaviors that they wouldn't typically perform if they were being individuated, if they could be identified as an individual. And lastly, what about group decision making? We make a lot of important decisions in life in groups. We can kind of bounce ideas off of them. Are we better at making decisions in groups than making decisions on our own? Well, the evidence suggests no. We tend to make riskier decisions, and we tend to focus on the dominant opinion of the group without considering other equally plausible options. The majority influence is extremely powerful in decision making. For example, a lot of information goes unshared. If other people aren't aware of the same information that I have, think about normative social influence. We want to fit in, we don't want to stand out, so we might not bring up information that people aren't already mentioning. And this follows into what's known as groupthink. People within a group want to seek harmony, want to discourage dissent, and because of this, group members self-censor. They may not give up or divulge or discuss information that should be discussed in these groups because no one wants to speak out. And the idea of groupthink has had a powerful influence on a lot of the poor decisions that have been made throughout the years. But it is important to know that the minority can have an influence. The minority can speak up and change the ways in which the majority are thinking within groups. They just have to kind of step up and take a stand. So that's all I have today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.